Okay, there it goes.
Okay, welcome to our Friday seminar. My name is Jennifer Dillon. I'm a faculty member in the School of Urban Studies and Planning, and along with Professor Rob Bertini, help organize this weekly seminar. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to remind you that if you ask a question, you need to use the microphone in front of you so the folks out in webland who are viewing this either live or in the future can hear your question in addition to our speaker's answers. So you need to hold down where it says touch and keep holding it while you're asking the question. The light should be on. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Phil Goff, who is works for the City of Portland Bureau of Planning in their urban design program section. Team. Talking about bicycle-friendly Portland 101. I'm going to have him tell you a little bit more about himself.
Great, thanks. I was told I sort of need to stay back here for the cameras, so it might be a little awkward, but I'll just be positioned back here. One thing, little disclaimer, is that I do work for the city, but none of what you're about to see here really has anything to do with the job I do for the city. I do land use planning and urban design. There's actually some of the bike planners are here in the room, so I don't really do any bike planning for the city. I put this slideshow together really on my own time. I've been a bike activist in Portland for the last 7 or 8 years, and I've been on the city's bike advisory committee since 1997. So just a little disclaimer there. And why don't we just start out with the first slide. So ignore the little logo on the bottom right. As I said, being a bike activist, I put the show together actually a number of years ago for the inaugural Bike Summer event in San Francisco in 1999. And I've presented this at Bike Summer events since then, including Portland's last year. So that sort of explains the tag there. What I'm going to do is go through and give you sort of a general overview of sort of bike planning, bike policy, and some design issues, and touch upon like transit and bike connectivity in this presentation. For lack of a better name, I did call it Bike-Friendly Portland 101. For those of you who aren't cyclists, Portland is very well known as a bike-friendly city. It typically is awarded is typified as the most bike-friendly city in North America. It's received numerous accolades and acknowledgments of that, etc. So, you've probably seen lots of other slideshows that begin with this view, and sometimes I think it's like a city ordinance that anyone who works for the city giving a slideshow has to start with the Mount Hood view. But in this case, there is some relevance to it. It isn't just kind of thrown up there. And the relevance here is the story of what made Portland a bike-friendly community really began in about the mid-'70s or so, and early and mid-'70s. And this hallmark view of Mount Hood was threatened as sprawl and traffic congestion and air pollution really was sort of taking over parts of the city and downtown. And it was really this time period where lots of things were happening at a state and citywide level to reduce some of those pollution issues and contain sprawl, save farmland, etc. I'm sure a lot of you know that story, and I won't really get into it. If you recall, when I started out, I put this presentation together for Bike Summer events in different cities. This is really the first time I presented to a group of Portland-only people. So there may be some stuff in here that you've already seen or know about. So apologize for those. So next slide here. So in that time period, as I'm sure you all know, early 70s, Harbor Drive was taken out and replaced by Waterfront Park. Next. In 1977, 78, federal funds some of the federal funds that were going to be used for a freeway, the Mount Hood Freeway, were used both for the bus transit mall downtown next and for the light rail system. That's a shot that maybe some of you haven't seen of the plan, an aerial photograph of the plan for the Mount Hood Freeway. That wasn't built in the mid-'70s because of that opposition, and because the federal law did allow the funds that initially were to be used for the freeway to go into transit projects. So it might not be recognizable, but let's see, this is Clinton Street here, I believe, and this is Powell is somewhere in there. Or Division, that's right. This is Division, and I think that's Clinton. Or it's pretty amazing. This is sort of the end of the Ross Island Bridge, the east end. So to give you a little sense for what the scale of that freeway at the time. But I know a lot of you, especially the students here, are probably going to probably know about this history or soon will in your studies. Next. So also at the time, there was concern for creating a funding source for bike and pedestrian projects as another way to sort of cut down or to create alternative transportation and to potentially cut down on air pollution and sprawl issues. So a state law, ORS 366.514, was passed in the mid-'70s, which mandated that 1% of all state highway funds be funneled into bicycle and transportation projects. So one early example of that law taking effect was on the construction of the I-205 freeway on the east side of Portland, where many of you have probably seen there is a bike path pedestrian trail facility. Next. Also, this example, Barber Boulevard, another state highway that when it was repaved or reconstructed or widened, I'm not sure exactly what had happened, about 5 years ago or so, bike lanes were striped, again, as a requirement. The bill states that anytime the state highway funds are used to reconstruct a road, that provisions need to be made for pedestrians and bicyclists, and that doesn't automatically mean that every single project is going to get bike lanes or sidewalks. There are some exceptions, but there needs to be some provision for bikes and pedestrians, at least within a parallel corridor. Next. A great example of the efficacy of and the power of this law was in the city of Portland in the early 90s when the Blazers and Paul Allen built the Rose Garden Arena. And the original plans were to include a street network around the stadium that did not include bike lanes. It had sidewalks, but it didn't include really a way for bikes to filter through the Rose Quarter area safely and efficiently. And at the time, I think it was the early 90s, the Bicycle Transportation Alliance, which is a local advocacy group, successfully sued the city of Portland for not adhering to the state bill that requires a certain percentage of funds be used for bike and pedestrian facilities, and they won that battle in court. Next, and you could see, if you go there, you'll see a number of the streets around the Rose Quarter do include bike lanes now, and it's a pretty integral part of the bike network within the sort of inner east side area. So bike policy next really begins with the Bicycle Master Plan, which was adopted in 1996, and it really sort of guides the future policy decisions in Portland to create a more bike-friendly city. And it does some of the goals that are stated in the master plan, some sort of key numbers in there is by the year 2015 that there be a 10% citywide modal split, bike modal split. That is the percentage of trips made by bicycle. And inner citywide, 15% modal split. I'm not sure where we are. I suspect that may be a little tough to reach in 2015, but we're probably going to be relatively close. So included in the Bike Master Plan next are issues like design details for, say, a bike boulevard, for example, on the left, or how to how to appropriately design a bike lane crossing a railroad track, for instance. Next. It spells out some provisions for bike parking issues. Next. And really primarily what it does within the bike master plan is a planned network of bike routes throughout the whole city of Portland. This map is showing a much larger chunk than just the city of Portland. This is Metro's regional bike map. But really much of what you see here, and this one's a little confusing because the red and the orange lines aren't necessarily bike routes with bike lanes or trails. They just happen to show here where bikes have some connectivity throughout the region. But really the darker colors, the greens, the blues, and the purples are in this slide are the actual bike routes. And I'll show some more detail to give you a better idea. How many people here are sort of regular bike commuters and have probably seen maps like this before? So certainly a good chunk of you. It's good to know. So currently in the system within the city of Portland, there's about 150 miles of striped bike lanes on streets. There's about 30 miles of bike boulevards, and I'll get into that a little later, what a bike boulevard really is, and about 60 miles of off-street pathways. Next. So there's a couple of fuzzy slides here, but I wanted to give you a sense for the history of the bike network. This is really what it looked like in 1983, and this was just about 10 years after the passing of the state bike bill. So in its first 10 years, it didn't have too much of an impact. In terms of a color key, the blue, if you could even tell if it's blue, the darkest line are the bike lanes, and the magenta or pink are the trails, which here are concentrated on the river or in Forest Park in the upper left, and then the green are the bike boulevards. So 10 years after the passing of the bike bill, there still wasn't very much infrastructure for bikes within the city. Next. This shows the same network in 1993, and in the early 90s was really when the sort of foundation for what we have now was really created. This was a time of significant change for bike infrastructure in Portland. It was just after the creation of the bike program within the city's Office of Transportation, and it was also just after the formation of the Bicycle Transportation Alliance. So for the first time, there was really a significant citywide or statewide, in this case, lobbying force, really pushing for additional facilities for bicyclists. Next slide. This is a planned and funded bikeways in '97. This is generally the network today at a little closer scale than the map a few slides back. To give you an idea of, what is a pretty fully integrated network currently that pretty much allows, in my opinion, pretty much allows cyclists to generally get to all parts of the city on relatively safely and efficiently on some sort of bike facility, a bike trail, or a ped bike trail, a bike lane, or a bike boulevard. Next. And then the bike master plan, the sort of 20-year vision for 2015, spells out a system that looks something like this. And it pretty much, other than the central city, it sort of creates a matrix of bike routes pretty much at about a quarter to half-mile increments in both cardinal directions. You have some sort of bike boulevard or bike lane facility. Next. It's really made a tremendous difference, I think, in Portland. Creating that infrastructure certainly has increased the demand and increased the number of cyclists out using the facilities. It gives you an idea in the, if you can't read the key there, the pink bars are the miles of bikeways, and a bikeway is really any of those three. It's the trails, the lanes, or the bike boulevards. So you could see from 91 on the left-hand side to 99 on the right-hand side, that quantity pretty much doubled, it looks like. And the amount of cyclists using the downtown bridges, which is really the simplest way the city has to get an idea of how many people are actually riding their bikes on a daily basis, or at least during the weekdays, I think is when they take the counts. In the same way, it's gone up in generally the same proportion. And people usually ask, what happened in 95? I don't have an answer for you, other than maybe there's a number of rainy days in a, excuse me, something fun? Something funky happened. But generally, the trend is clearly there. Since I did mention, people are always asking what happened in 95. Please, I don't mind if anyone throws out questions as I'm going along for clarification or anything like that. Is there already one? I'm glad I mentioned it.
On the last slide of the 1997 map, do you have any idea why between Ankeny and Woodstock there's not really any bike lanes heading eastbound?
Can
it's
you
all
go back a slide or two slides, I guess? You're saying between Ankeny, which is here, and Woodstock, which is somewhere down in here? You're talking about a gap like in this area? Well, Mount Tabor is there. Is that what you're referring to? Mount Tabor is there. This is also, I think, there was an extension of the Burnside bike route very recently. So there is a bike lane or a bike boulevard that does connect Burnside and Ankeny here. The Belmont's in there now, which is in here. But I guess, Mount Tabor's there, so there is that. It kind of precludes some connectivity. I don't know, maybe Roger or Jeff, both of who work for the Office of Transportation, who do bike planning issues, may know. I'm not sure if there's...
If I can operate this. I think the question was why there are no bike lanes in that area, east-westbound. Is that right?
Yeah, in that gap.
I think it has to do mostly with the use of the streets, and the street widths tend to be somewhat narrower, I think, in southeast than perhaps other parts of the city. North Portland, we have some pretty wide streets that make it a little, sort of facilitate the addition of bike lanes. In southeast, I think you're faced with removing parking, and commercial districts like Hawthorne, Belmont, pretty intensely used. It's not real feasible to remove parking in areas like that.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Why don't we keep going then? Back to the graph. Okay, so the numbers of cyclists using the bridges, and presumably then throughout the whole city, has gone up quite significantly in the last 10 years. Next, to a degree that in some places we're actually seeing congestion, like bicycle mini traffic jams. And for those of you, really the one place it's happening, I'd say, is the Hawthorne Bridge. For those of you who may come over during commute hours, it's somewhat typical to see groups of cyclists at the light who are heading westbound at the light at Grand Avenue, or those heading eastbound from the downtown side, really sort of get clumped up. And it's sort of exciting for me, and I'm sure other bike advocates and planners, to sort of see that we've reached a level where there are actually some congestion points on the bike network. Next. So I'm going to go through, give you an idea of really what the bike network is, and there's really four elements: the trails, bike lanes, and boulevards, but also bridge connections are a huge part of maintaining the connectivity in a city environment, urban environment that has a river or any sort of large body of water there. Next. So the trail network, there's sort of an inner loop that's focused around the waterfront. That's about 3 miles. On the west side, on the waterfront, the Esplanade on Tom McCall Waterfront Park. Next. And that loops around on both the Hawthorne Bridge and the Steel Bridge, connecting to the East Bank Esplanade, which was just completed about 3 or 4 years ago. Next. At that point, typically when I show this presentation to people from other cities, I show about 5 or 6 slides of the floating walkway, which just blows everyone away. Typically right after that last one, but I'll spare you because I'm sure all of you have seen the wonderful but very expensive floating walkway. There's an outer loop trail system, which is called the 40-mile loop, and I think it's been expanded to like 80 or 90 miles at this point, but it's still considered, still called the 40-mile loop. And this is just sort of one of those places in the city where you actually have a intersection of two trails on the network, the Springwater Trail going horizontal across the page and the I-205 trail sort of curving through. And there's actually little miniature stop signs there, which I'm sure very few people ever stop at, but they are there. It's kind of a fun element. Next. So talk about bike lanes and the different strategies, the planning and design strategies for implementing bike lanes in different urban conditions. There's the real easy one, and that is streets like this, Water Avenue in Southeast, where the travel lane was wide enough, it was probably 15 or 16 feet, that striping a bike lane required no removal of parking or reduction of lane capacity, etc. That's sort of the easiest one. So the next level up is taking a street like Broadway, Northeast Broadway, which in the mid-90s when it was reconstructed, I believe a lane of traffic was, it was a 4-lane, a one-way street, was reduced to 3 lanes. The sidewalks were widened and a one-way, in this case the westbound bike lane was striped on Broadway here. And also curb extensions and other traffic calming treatment was placed on Broadway as well. It was really a great project from the mid-90s. That's sort of the next level up, reducing a lane. There's also a reconfiguration of an existing lane structure. This was Northeast Gleason Street about 10 years ago, 2 lanes in each direction next. And the reconfiguration, and this has happened in many streets throughout Portland. It was reconfigured to include 1 travel lane in each direction, a center median lane to accommodate left turns, and then striped bike lanes on each side. So in this case, parking was maintained and a lane of traffic was taken out. And given the volumes on a street like Gleason, most engineers would tell you a configuration like this not only is more efficient, but much more safer for automobiles, not just cyclists, simply because it takes the left-turning cars sort of out of the travel lane. So in a 2-lane configuration, left-turning cars who are sitting there waiting create a lot of friction and havoc and potential accidents when they swerve to get out of the way to avoid the car in front of them. So a reconfiguration like this works better for cyclists, for motorists, and I'd probably say for the neighborhood. It calms the street down a little and makes for a visually a narrower street. Next. For those of you who bike around, you've probably seen these. It's really one of the, I think, special treats about biking in Portland, and that is as PDOT stripes bike lanes, frequently when they put the bike stencil in, they're putting in little additions, just I think to make cycling a little more fun in Portland. There's one example, I don't know where this is, of a guy with a cape. There's one around the corner here on Broadway next to PSU with cyclists carrying a diploma, wearing a mortarboard, which is a fun one. Next. And then probably the most intricate one is a cyclist with a trailer in the back as well. I think that's still there. Or that may have been removed. That was removed. Yeah, this was on Northwest Broadway, and it was repaved, and that was taken out. So I've captured it forever here, which is good. It was semi-guerrilla. It was done by an employee of the city, but I don't think he necessarily had the permission of his supervisors. So
he did it on his own time during breaks.
Aha. Okay, for the record, we now know that. Okay. Sort of opens the question is if you're the one that did it, but.
No,
No, but you probably know him. I've heard he was recently been released, right? Or he doesn't work for PDOT anymore, the person that used to do it.
Yeah,
Yes.
he was, Phil. I think he's been gone for a couple of years, but it's interesting that the people that do the striping crew has kind of picked up the tradition recently, and now the whole crew kind of
They all do it.
strategizes on design, and they kind of recycle little scraps of pavement markings, and they cut them out at home, not on city time. Important to make that distinction, and so when they have an opportunity to do a bike lane like this, they'll implement their design.
Great. Let's hope they keep it coming. It does, for those of you who don't bike, when I ride around and I get, especially on new bike lanes, and come across one that's different than the last one I saw, it just makes bicycling that much more enjoyable in the city. It's really great. Next. So now I want to get to bike boulevards and take you on a little tour of kind of a typical bike boulevard, or probably the most successful one in the city in inner southeast neighborhood, the Harrison-Lincoln Bike Boulevard, which I'll go from right to left. And the green stripe, this is a blow-up of the initial metro map of the whole region. This is showing inner southeast and downtown area up in here. So the green stripe in this case is Bike Boulevard, and it does connect to a bike lane system into downtown. I'll take you on a tour for those of you who haven't been on this Bike Boulevard, or maybe have never been on any, give you an idea of really what it means. And a Bike Boulevard generally is strategies along the route to either lower traffic volume or to lower traffic speed without necessarily having stripes in the road that define a specific place for cyclists. The cyclists are sharing the streets with cars, but they're on a street where ostensibly the volume and the speeds of traffic are much lower. So next slide. We'll start this little Bike Boulevard tour at 39th Street. And again, the strategy here was to lower the volumes on that street. So at 39th, where I believe it's Harrison at this point, where Harrison crosses 39th, cars are not allowed to, there is a signal here that you can't see, but cars are not allowed to make the straight movement. When a car coming from either direction hits 39th, they're forced to take a left or a right turn. And you see the do not enter sign there. But bikes are allowed to proceed straight by building a landscape curb extension on one side and just maintaining a little slip lane in there for bikes to come through. And this geometry and the dimensions here were very much based on also the turning movements for fire trucks and stuff, because that's always a big concern with any traffic calming measure, is the impact it may have on fire trucks and other emergency vehicles. So the Bike Boulevard tour begins 39th next. As you're proceeding on Harrison, between 39th and 20th, there's a couple places where a small roundabout is placed in the middle of the intersection. So here they're not diverting traffic and lowering the volumes, but they're slowing down the speeds. And there's a couple of these. They're really wonderfully landscaped. Came in not necessarily as part of a bike planning strategy. This was more of a neighborhood livability projects in, I believe, the early 80s that were built in a few places around the city. This kind of stuff really hasn't been done in a number of years due to the cost issues. Really expensive to do something like this. But they're really wonderful amenities. And they're great for cyclists. So along that route, you have a small roundabout next. There's a couple of those in that stretch. Coming down, proceeding down Lincoln then, there is another sort of curb extension that again slows down cars. And even cars are allowed to go straight here, but the sign kind of encourages them to take a left, although legally they can't take a left or a right or proceed straight. And bikes very easily can proceed straight without really slowing down too significantly. This is also right near a four-way stop sign as well. I think when any element like a large curb extension or a roundabout or something is placed within the right-of-way within a curb-to-curb, that some sort of signage typically comes along with it just to give additional direction to motorists, additional warning. So, like at the roundabouts, if you go back, I don't know if we can see it. Yeah, at the roundabouts, all of them will have a sign like that, and others will have these tall yellow reflectors. A sign like that sort of gives a clue to motorists how to take a left, because that's oftentimes what confuses motorists in small roundabouts like this, is they're not sure whether to just cut in front of it to take a left or to go 3/4 of the way around. So, Todd, did you have another question? Yeah. Okay, next. Next. And then a few more blocks down, there is a diverter, which then reduces the volume still at 20th Avenue, and it just precludes cars from cutting straight across 20th Avenue with a small median, or just a curb basically placed in the middle, and slots or notches were left in it to allow cyclists to proceed straight. Next. This then comes through Ladd's addition, and again, another strategy on the bike boulevard is to create a place where bicyclists are allowed to take some sort of turning motion, but motorists aren't. Like here, motorists or all vehicles originally could just take a left if they wished here. I think this is at Clay and Ladd Street, but a median was placed in there, and again, a little notch left open so cyclists could take a left, but motorists needed to proceed straight. Next. And then this boulevard connects to the Madison, the Hawthorne and Madison Street bike lane system next, which then, next. Yeah, I did. I tried to say it really quickly. Which then brings you to the Hawthorne Bridge, which ostensibly sort of completes that tour. Yeah, Greg, and then there's a question over here, too.
Okay, sure. Back one slide, there's one element that I think is kind of interesting, too, to point out, and that's the blue bike lanes that Portland has that not many other cities in our country do that, indicate that it's kind of a point for vehicles to pay special attention as they're merging into the bike lane and things like that. Mm-hmm. And it's a model, I think, after some European cities. So. Yeah,
what he's referring to, and you can see, it's hard to see here, but you can see the sign better than anything. This section here where there's the tendency for motorists there's the reality of motorists cutting across a bike lane in a place where there's a significant hazard. There are there's sort of painted blue bike lane areas to give sort of an additional warning to motorists to sort of look out for cyclists. Personally, I wish they were a different color. I don't think they're quite bright enough, and I'm not sure, how efficient they are. If they were like bright orange, which I know the state DOT really wasn't happy about using a number of different colors, and the city settled on blue, which was kind of unfortunate. But I know in San Francisco they're planning on some bright red bike lanes. And in countries in Europe, and Switzerland especially, Germany and the Netherlands, there's entire cities where every square inch of bike lane is painted a different bright color to really sort of accentuate, places where bikes really have the right of way versus cars. So thanks for bringing that up. There's another question over here too.
Yeah, with the next slide on the Hawthorne Bridge.
Okay.
Getting back to your traffic jams and stuff that you brought up earlier, is there any way of making the bike route one way on each side of the bridge? You get two-way traffic that's not really wide enough when it's busy.
Yeah, there was, when this was planned and designed, there was a lot of talk about trying to figure out a way to make it a one-way facility. And one of the problems was the connections down to, especially now in the East Bank Esplanade, sort of having the ability to sort of control the one-way movements on the bridge were difficult, given that there were all these attractions on each side, on now the east and west side of the river, on both north of the bridge and south of the bridge. So there was that issue of sort of the difficulty of really controlling the direction of travel. And actually, Roger Geller is from the city, and I know I asked him this very question about 6 months ago by email, and he wrote back with a much more articulate answer that I've forgotten some of his points. So why don't I let him jump in for a few seconds here?
Well, the intent is to make it one way for bikes, and the city's working on a bikeway signing project. That once those signs are installed, it will direct westbound cyclists to the north side of the bridge and southbound cyclists to the east side of the bridge. I think part of the problem is that with the Esplanade and Waterfront Park making a nice loop, the north sidewalk is the view side. You get the nice view of the downtown from that side, and so people tend to head towards that side. So the first step will be to encourage one-way traffic through signing, and if that doesn't work, we'll have to revisit it.
Great. So this kind of completes really the connection from a point in inner southeast Portland, 39th and 39th and Harrison, into the downtown next.
Oh, wait, one question.
Yeah.
Maybe this is a question for Roger. In riding this surface on the Hawthorne Bridge, there tends to be a pitching motion. Did you all maybe pick the width of the panels based on ride comfort, or was that something that maybe was noticed after the installation?
I'm glad you didn't ask me that question. I'd have no answer.
I don't think there was any thought at all about creating any kind of a pitching motion. I thought that it was the county's project, and I think the materials were selected primarily for weight. And I think you're talking mostly about on the lift span portion. No, I've noticed it mostly on the lift span, and I've noticed it mostly if you ride towards the railing. If you ride away from the railing, it's a very smooth, even ride. So I'm not sure quite what's going on there. But I know that the lift span, they used a coated metal surface to make it lighter.
Great. Next. So the Hawthorne Bridge is really that prime conduit from the southeast neighborhoods into downtown. And really one of the best elements of the bike network in Portland is the reality that downtown Portland, even without bike lanes on most streets, is very easy to navigate. And that's due mostly to the timing of the traffic signals. Given the tight one-way street grid that we have, it's relatively easy to time signals to control motorist speed. So downtown, the signals are configured to allow really a maximum of 12 miles an hour during the peak periods and 15 miles an hour during the off-peak periods. And not that that's done specifically for bicyclists. There are other reasons. Probably the primary reason is just for the sort of quality of life issues of downtown, the pedestrian-friendly quality of it. But it certainly makes biking through downtown a lot easier. And it's for those intrepid enough to be able to ride like the cyclists there, especially in the middle of the road or just in the middle of the lane on the right or left-hand side. It's pretty easy to do. You can stay within the flow of traffic relatively easily. But in downtown, the few places where it's hard to maintain that 12 or 15 mile an hour speed because of grade changes up hills, there are a few bike lanes like on Broadway and Jefferson that do allow you to have the slower speed and cars can pass. Next. So that sort of a segue into talking about the bridges as an important part of the bike network. And the Hawthorne Bridge, which we just saw, it's really a great story, great success story of what good bike planning and citizen advocacy can really do to improve a situation for cycling. And before 1997, for those of you who are here, the sidewalks on the Hawthorne Bridge were, I think, 5 or 6 feet wide. It was pretty much just enough for a cyclist to ride along, and if there was a pedestrian there, the pedestrian would either have to really crowd close against the edge, or the cyclist would have to stop and walk around. Not the most comfortable situation. Of course, we had fewer cyclists and pedestrians probably using the bridge then, but it really wasn't a great situation. When the bridge was reconstructed in 97, 98, there was a long and hard campaign by BTA and other bike advocates, and I think the city of Portland was also really pushing the county to find some funds to improve the bridge and widen the sidewalks next, which is really what you have today. But besides widening the sidewalks, what's really crucial, the crucial lesson about the bridge connections in the bike network isn't just to make a bridge bike friendly, but that bridge really needs to connect to something on either side. Next. So, next, please. So in the planning for the Hawthorne Bridge, the sidewalks weren't the only improvements made, but also at the east and west ends, the integration into the rest of the bike network. For instance, on the west side here, those improvements were made as well. This was the way a cyclist before '97 used to, from downtown heading eastbound, used to access the Hawthorne Bridge. The cyclists had to yield to motorists or to cars and vehicles coming from the right who only had their own yield sign. So certainly the onus of responsibility was on a cyclist to stop, really wait for traffic and go across, and then quickly take a sharp left onto the narrow sidewalk. That was reconfigured. Next. Improvements were made on both sides, but this one was probably the most significant improvement. So cars, instead of yielding and flowing onto the bridge, had to stop, and cyclists had to clear right of way. There isn't even a yield sign for cyclists. So now it's sort of a continuous flow onto the bridge. Pedestrian improvements were made at this intersection as well. Yeah.
Do you know if there was any consideration for putting a railing along the sidewalk, just because there's a drop-off when you're going across, it being so close to the cars? Do you know if that?
I suspect that wasn't considered, given that the sidewalk is relatively wide. It was intended to be one-way travel, although it isn't literally, but it was intended for more one-way travel. And then the speeds of the traffic are not, I don't believe, significant enough that it really increased the intimidation factor. A guardrail will be placed on the improvements to the Morrison Bridge, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, because the speeds on the Morrison Bridge are much greater, and also because it will be a two-way bike facility. Next. Another great example of sort of integrating the bridge connections into the city network is at the Broadway Bridge on the east side, and this was sort of the mess that cyclists would encounter before the improvements to the Broadway Bridge in the late 90s. So this is heading eastbound, coming off the bridge. If you were on the sidewalk, you were sort of dumped into Broadway in a sort of street configuration that looked like this. Next slide. And this was pretty significantly rebuilt. I believe the same amount of lanes for autos were maintained. I think they were probably narrowed a bit, and a bike lane was striped in, and just a little curb extension was placed here. So someone coming off the sidewalk, where before you had to either stay on the sidewalk or maybe hop the curb, now there's pretty much a continuous flow for bikes. That may be a place where there's a blue bike lane now as well. Pretty much a continuous flow for bikes, and responsibility to yield is on the motorist rather than the cyclist. So you have this really great integration that really works on both sides of the bridge. Yeah, question there?
I just want to make a comment. I come down that hill every day, and there's bike traffic on that street too, not just the Hawthorne.
That's good. That's great. Yeah, actually, I was there yesterday, and especially now that all the bikes are on the north side or the west side. I don't know which side, the left-hand side here of the bridge. You got two-way now because of the construction, and yeah, I did see a lot of congestion there too. That's great to see. So that's another example of improvements to the bridge connection. Next one. Now, the Morrison Bridge is the last remaining non-freeway bridge in the central city that really has no significant infrastructure for cyclists. That will soon change, and this is a project I was involved with a number of years ago. The situation now on the Morrison Bridge for cyclists or pedestrians is a very narrow 5-foot sidewalk immediately adjacent to traffic in the 40 to 50 mile an hour range, and the columns for the signs also interrupt the sidewalk and squeeze it down to about 3.5 feet. So this next slide. Actually, could you go back? Keep it there for a sec. When the Hawthorne Bridge was closed, a temporary facility was placed on the Morrison Bridge to accommodate the thousands of bikes that were using the Hawthorne Bridge. At that time, it occurred to me and some others that having a facility on the Morrison Bridge is something that maybe should be there permanently because it was incredibly popular. Actually, the numbers of riders using the Morrison Bridge exceeded the numbers of riders using the Hawthorne Bridge at the time. So next slide. So the background I have in design and architecture, I sort of came up with this vision of how transforming the bridge by removing a lane of traffic and making this super wide kind of esplanade that could have planters and trellises and all kinds of fancy stuff on it. And I knew at the time that getting it rebuilt in this way was unlikely, but I used this design as sort of a lobbying tool, and myself and some others in the BTA and Bike Advisory Committee and other bike activists did sort of a postcard campaign, letter writing campaign, and also used this as kind of a vision to get people excited about the possibilities for the bridge. And $1.5 million of federal funds were granted to improve the bike and pedestrian conditions on this bridge. And in 2005, the spring of 2005, the bridge will be under construction, and the final plan is not as elaborate as this, but it maintains the 6 lanes of traffic. But that bridge will now have a 15-foot wide sidewalk. If you go back on the south side of the bridge, which is this view, this 5-foot sidewalk will widen to 15 feet, and it'll have a guardrail, as John had mentioned, or John had asked about, a guardrail on the north side, and it'll have two-way bike travel, and there'll again be those crucial improvements on each end to integrate into the system. Next two. Access to transit. It's certainly important to get those intermodal connections. It sort of expands the range of cyclists and giving them the ability to go much greater distances if they wish. Next. So TriMet really has a great program of accessibility for cyclists, including bike racks on every single bus in the city. Next. And as many of you probably know, the MAX is fully bike accessible. Next. And recently they've even sort of taken out a few seats on some of the low-floor MAX trains and reserved a space for bikes to be hung vertically because they found so many people were taking their bikes on the trains that it was creating some congestion. Good, in my mind, good, positive congestion problems. So some of the trains now have retrofitted with these hooks so you can hang the bikes and kind of get them out of the way a bit. Next. Kind of looks like that with the bike hanging next to one of the entries. And these are only in the low-floor MAX cars. Next. Transit routes themselves are certainly ideal opportunities to integrate multimodal corridors. And here on Interstate Avenue, if you haven't seen, the MAX line is pretty much complete, although not running. The construction is pretty much complete. And what was a pretty miserable, ugly-looking 4-lane boulevard or avenue now has 1 lane of traffic with some left turn pockets, light rail in the middle, and bike lanes in each direction for about 80% of the length of Interstate Avenue. Next. Unfortunately, in downtown, the integration of bikes and transit hasn't quite happened as seamlessly. Part of it may have been just a different kind of planning mentality at the time, but on both the light rail mall next and on the bus mall, very dark, the bus mall downtown are two certainly ideal opportunities to have multimodal corridors where pedestrians, bikes, and transit vehicles could really share the same space. And on the bus mall, it's illegal to ride your bike on places where only buses are allowed. And on the light rail cross mall in the previous slide, bikes can go where cars can go. If you could go back one, only a 12-foot travel lane was maintained next to the light rail vehicle, and it could have very easily been another 2 or 3 feet wider, and a bike lane could have been fit in there, but it wasn't. It's still a reasonably decent bike route, but it wasn't the ideal integration that I think could have been a nice plan. Next. Also, the streetcar line, again, not the most ideal integration of transit with bicycle transportation. Even at a point where there are some areas along the streetcar line where a stripe was placed in, almost looking like a bike lane, although there's no stencils, but it kind of looks like a bike lane. I think enough to fool some people, but anyone riding in that bike lane will soon come to a large curb extension and be forced to go around it to the left and get tangled in the tracks. And there has been quite a number of minor accidents and some broken bones and cuts and bruises here and there, as far as I know. Next. So the solution is, and I just think, next slide, please. Yeah.
I know they're considering putting a streetcar network over to the east side, and some of the streets they're looking at are quite a bit wider than 10th and 11th. Has there been any consideration of having the streetcar be in the left lane? That way you could have, say a couple lanes of traffic and maintain a bike lane on the right side?
I'm sure it was considered. I think the major reason it's not is so that because buses can only pick up and drop off people on the right-hand side, by having a streetcar on the same side as the bus, then they can share platforms. So again, you get better transit connections and transfers if a streetcar is on the right-hand side with the buses. It's not unheard of to have bike lanes on the left side. That is possible, and there are. It's not favored, but there are some places in the city where there are bike lanes on the left side. I think it's going to be a little more carefully integrated when the streetcar comes in on the east side. Yeah.
Just because I know on Lovejoy, there's that one part where there's a bike lane, and the bike lane goes behind the streetcar, and I hate it. I just go on the...
Yeah. There'll probably be
doesn't seem like a good solution.
More little detailed configurations like that. And I think some people like that and others don't. I think it's a nice design for novice and beginner cyclists. But for people like you and me, like I tend to just, unless there's a car there, I tend to just ride in the middle of the tracks as well to go around it. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I ride this route every week, and I find cars don't like driving on the tracks, and so it's actually almost like a bike lane. Mm-hmm. Any chance of stenciling a shared tram and bike lane?
I suspect not, only because to encourage bicyclists to ride in the middle of the tracks is, I know it's what you mean, and I'm saying that I don't think it'll happen because I don't think it's necessarily the right thing to do to encourage cyclists to ride in the middle of the tracks, simply because of the danger factor of a beginner cyclist in the rain having to, swerve out of the way quickly to avoid something. Does increase the chances of a bike getting the wheel caught in the track, which is a great segue. Next slide. The funniest slide, especially for the outer town people who've never seen this, they just can't believe that anyone would make a sign like this. And there's it's always a mix, 50-50 people who are appalled, and the other half just think it's the greatest, funniest thing they've ever seen. So I think it would be sort of a conflict to have a sign like this saying stay away from the tracks, and then a stencil in the middle of the street saying stay between the tracks. But I agree with you. It's especially given that where the streetcar turns near Northrop, there isn't full automobile access through there, so it does almost act like a bike trail that connects you from downtown into parts of the Northwest, because there's almost no traffic volume on it whatsoever. So, yeah.
You thought where bicyclists should ride on streets where there's streetcar tracks? Or like where's the ideal spot? Or do you just need to design it differently in the future?
Well, streets like 10th and 11th, the volumes and speeds are relatively low enough that a cyclist probably belongs in the left-hand lane, taking the whole lane in the middle. And again, if a cyclist can maintain a 12, 15 mile an hour speed, it's pretty comfortable to ride in the left. A cyclist like me, I'll just ride wherever there isn't a car, and I don't mind being, and Todd, we don't mind being in between tracks. But I think that's, these signs tend to be on the right-hand side of the streets, kind of encouraging cyclists to use the left. So. Next. Okay, transit. I forgot where we were. So, certainly, not only do you want to extend the range of the ability for cyclists to come from longer distances and put their bike on a bus, but also certainly at transit stations, having that covered bike parking to give people the confidence that their bike won't get wet and rusty is a good thing. Next. And in some transit stations, there's both short-term parking and long-term bike lockers, which allow someone to rent it for a very small fee, or actually I think it's free now, and keep their bike both dry and vandal safe. Those make great chairs too for teenagers. Next. Bike parking. Let's see, we go to 1:30, right? Okay, it's 1 o'clock. Great. Bike parking. Certainly there's lots and lots of bike parking in the public right-of-way downtown. Next. There are also a few bike lockers within public right-of-way downtown. Next. And the city has done an absolutely, positively magnificent job in the last couple months, Greg, thank you, of putting lots of new bike racks within the right-of-way in the last few months. So there's hundreds and hundreds of racks throughout the city, but there's only one, I think, that I know of like this. And these are called art racks, and there's a bunch of them around town. Again, sort of like the stencils in the bike lanes, just kind of adds a little fun and interest to cycling throughout the city. This is a coffee mug in front of a coffee shop. Next. There's in the shadow there's in front of a bike shop, there's a bike rack shaped as a bike. Next. And in the Pearl District, there's a couple of these, basically scaled-down models of the Fremont Bridge you see in the background that are used as bike racks and also public art as well. Next. Yeah.
On those bridge racks, just a little fun thing. I was talking to Merrill Denny, who made them, and the cars that are on the bridges, there's a few, each bridge has some unique cars that he kind of put in there as a little fun. So if you want to challenge yourself to find the different cars on the bridge, it might be a fun game.
So each of the 5 or 6 racks are literally a little different? I know, I've seen little SUVs on there. I didn't know they were different. Next. This kind of sends a mixed message, but I thought it was a funny one. Again, you could be appalled or you could think it's funny. A bike rack shaped as a car. It's kind of a weird mixed message, but it's consistent. Where the other ones, are a coffee mug in front of a coffee shop, a bike in front of a bike shop. This is in front of a parking lot. So it seems kind of reasonable that you design a bike rack to look like a car. Next, yeah.
I actually see bicycles parked near most of these art racks.
The bridges, I don't think I've ever seen one parked to the bridge. The bridge ones are difficult. They're not. One of the problems with the art racks is they're not always designed with efficiency in mind. That some of them are designed more as, I think, more on the side of public art as bike parking. The coffee mug is a pretty standard staple rack with a few accoutrements on it. The bridge is probably the extreme one that's most difficult, I think, to lock your front wheel or a wheel and the frame to. So I think, it's an interesting question. You tend to sometimes not see bikes parked to them.
Maybe there should be like a program where you have a demo bike parked next to it for the first month so people actually realize it's a rack.
Yeah. I think maybe the bridges are so, I think, beautiful as little public sculptures that I think it sort of intimidates people. I don't think people even want to. Even if they knew how difficult it was, they probably wouldn't even want to because they just think, oh, that's public art. Shouldn't really touch it. Yeah.
I had to say that I spent a lot of time on the ground, looking at these things, and I do see a lot of people actually lock into these art racks more than I expected to see.
Really?
Some are more successful than the others. The ones that I think are more prevalent actually are these racks that are kind of like bollard racks. You might see them on the transit mall. They look like granite bollards with 2 little hoop rings on the sides. There's one right outside the Portland building, and those are the ones that I think are the least intuitive.
Are those actually bike racks?
Those are bike racks, yeah. They're super secure if you figure out that they're...
Can you get your wheel and a frame through those?
They were designed prior to those standards. So.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah.
You showed on your first slide of bicycles being parked, most of the bicycles were parked against parking meters. And as you know, in downtown, they've been taking out parking meters and replacing them with the pay stations. And I'm a person who, if I can't find a bike rack around, I'll use a parking meter. And there are large portions of downtown that basically have no bike racks. Mm-hmm. And you discover rather suddenly that there is no place to park. Is there any move by the city to replace those parking meters with poles at least?
I preceded your question about 5 minutes ago giving accolades to the city of Portland for putting in lots of new bike racks downtown, and one of the guys who plans them is here in the back who just asked the previous question. And there are, I think, 600 now, Greg? There's 600 bike racks that are ready to go?
I'm in the process right now of locating 500 new bike racks downtown, and I've got about 80% of downtown covered so far with actually siting them. We have 600 racks on order, and yesterday we actually just got in our security bolts that happened to be on back order for a while. It kind of pushed us back some as well. So probably within a month or so you're going to start to notice a lot more racks. And if you're curious where they're going to go, my tag is 2 dots. I put 2 dots on the ground where there's going to be a bike rack. So if you look around, you kind of notice. And basically what I try to do is get them within 50 feet of entrances to businesses and kind of gauge what level of bike traffic that business gets as to whether or not I put in extra and things like that. But I'm always open to getting requests too. So if you guys want to call PDOT and ask for me, Greg Raisman, be glad to talk to you about places that you think really need bike parking, and I'd really be glad to try to work with you to make it happen.
And it works. I've made many requests. I've got his number on my speed dial. Yeah.
Okay, this may sound like a strange question, but I know one of the motives for increasing bicycle use or making it a more bicycle-friendly city is environmental mitigation, air pollution and stuff. It seems to me that bike racks are made of metal, and if they were made with recycled content metal, that'd be another environmental, accolade we could promote. Is there any requirements that either the staple racks or the art racks are made with recycled content metal rather than virgin metal?
I don't think so, but Greg might have a better answer.
There isn't. We really are kind of cost-bound. So when we open up our bids, we have a very specific set of standards that talk about the dimensions of the pipe, and they talk about the dimensions of the rack and the quality and the type of galvanization that has to happen and things like that. Because of the amount of rain we get, if the powder coating comes off, we want to be galvanized so that it doesn't rust as quickly. So there's a lot of these types of requirements that make it kind of difficult for that to happen, I would guess, but it's not impossible. I mean, I think that if a manufacturer were to fit our specs that we call for when we're bidding out these staple racks and say, hey, we're fitting the specs and happen to be doing it with this type of piping, as if it fit the requirements, So that's really kind of the market-driven factor of it.
Great. I'm going to take one last question. I got maybe 12 more slides. I want to get through this. It's 10 after 1 right now.
Well, my comment would be that I think if you examine the economics of the steel-producing industry, you'll find that there's already significant recycled content. Scrap metal is a very important part of that production.
Great. Next slide. So when it comes to parking, the zoning code requires that there be both short-term and long-term parking within private property on all new development projects downtown, or throughout the whole city, I mean. And some examples, some ways to do that, typically in a downtown environment where you have buildings, zero lot line buildings, or buildings built literally to their property lines. What some developers are doing are designing, and this is sort of ideally what the code would love to see. Like the previous picture before, or a picture like this is creating an alcove next to an entry of some way and putting some bike racks in there is really sort of the best way to accommodate the code. And the amount of both short-term and long-term parking, it's probably pretty obvious, but it's based on the square footage of the retail and commercial and office space, and also the total number of housing units in the building. Next. So that was a couple examples where you have buildings built right to property lines and other buildings that aren't occupying the entire site, where there may be a parking lot or other open spaces. Great example of the Eco Trust building of putting all that required short-term parking front and center right near the entry is always sort of the ideal. Next. Another example at the city building where I work. Again, it's not built to the property lines, and there was space on the private property to just fit in a large number of bike racks along the side of the building. And during the summer, most of these racks fill up. You get a lot of people at both the city building, downtown the Portland building, and at the city building here on 4th Avenue. Very well used. Can you wait on that, or is it just a quick, I guess a very quick clarification is cool, but I want to get through the next 10.
Well, I guess it was my understanding that some of that code wasn't actually being met, and that it's being negotiated or renegotiated.
There are some changes that are occurring right now that are going through the planning commission stages to actually modify some of the code. But I think a pretty good agreement has been worked out between business interests and bike advocates in the city. When a certain threshold for short-term parking is reached, then developers are required to have covered parking, such as this small office building on Division Street. Next. Or in front of City Hall is another great example. Next. Next, please. Just covering parking does not meet the definition of long-term parking. Both of those previous ones were still short-term parking that just happened to be covered and out of the elements. Long-term parking needs to both be covered and have some sort of at least passive kind of security system by being within easy view corridor of some sort of active uses on the ground floor of a building, such as at the Portland building in the alcove downtown. Next. Or this is in the Portland building as well, or within some sort of parking garage structure that's secure. Other developers will put it in just separate bike rooms as well. So there needs to be that level of security besides being covered for long-term parking. Developers also are able to get density bonuses for going above and beyond the code and providing both locker rooms and shower rooms, as well as the long-term parking. There's a building, the ODS Tower downtown. They have this great indoor bike parking room with showers and locker rooms right adjacent to it. And this is right off the ground floor. You come in with a security key or a code or something. You come right in from the sidewalk, right into this space. It's probably one of the best long-term bike parking spaces in the city. And for their efforts, they got to build an extra 10,000 square feet or something onto the building. Signage is also required. Frequently not adhered to, but it is required in the code that signage be there to indicate to cyclists where short and long-term bike parking is required, or where it's located. Next. There's another example. Can't miss that one. Next. Unfortunately, the code is a little fuzzy when it comes especially to short-term bike parking. This bike parking, and this is a rack right here. Technically, that meets the code because it's like within 50 feet. You could securely park your bike there. It's within 50 feet of the entry, etc. This is in the very back, in kind of the service alley of a new building in Northwest. And the bike rack was placed adjacent to the loading dock, next to some, obviously, some kind of intimidating-looking electrical equipment, etc. And the dumpster is to the right as well. It's behind the dumpster. But the sign's there, so this accommodates code, but it certainly doesn't accommodate bicyclists. So there are some loopholes there. I think part of that is being worked out in the reworking of the code that's going on currently that he had asked about. Another sort of loophole that's been found or was found, hopefully it's going to change, bike parking put in parking garages that are located underground is the Fox Tower downtown. And there's no signs, but and there's supposed to be according to the code. But even if there was, I don't think it would make any difference. You'd have to go down about 30 feet down into the bowels of the building to find the bike parking. But that was allowed currently, and I think that will soon change. It was allowed to put the short-term parking within the parking garage itself, even if it's completely invisible. So just as kind of a wrap-up, things are really great. We're a very bike-friendly city, but things are wonderful here. We're no way near the level of the sort of the integration of bicycling into our culture and into our transportation system, like, say, in Amsterdam. Things don't get too much better than that. So I just wanted to finish up with a couple slides. In Amsterdam or in Holland, the kind of mode split that they get is up in the 40 and 30% range. It's the red. The red is bicycle, so like in a 1.5 to 3 mile distance, they're getting about 40% of their trips by bike. I think in Portland, in the city of Portland, we're still around the 2% range within the whole city. I think in the inner city downtown area, it's closer to 3 or 4%. But as wonderful as things are here, we've still got a long way to go. Next, and I think a big part of that is, acknowledging Portland is very much a part of. It's in America, don't forget. Very much part of a car culture here. Cheap gas and free parking pretty much everywhere throughout the city other than downtown is still going to keep the number of cyclists or number of people using bicycles for their primary mode of transportation down pretty low relative to some of these European cities. But Portland does certainly offer a great model for other cities in North America. So I just wanted to recap a few themes at the end here. Next. And a big theme, big one to keep in mind is overcoming barriers. And those barriers can be natural barriers like rivers, and getting a bridge network a bike network on the bridges is certainly one of the absolute key components. Next. Overcoming political barriers, and here in the extension of the Springwater Trail on the east side of the Willamette River, even when there's private property issues dealing with the railroad line on the left or industrial use on the right, squeezing in some sort of bike facility and overcoming those political barriers is certainly a key piece. Next, overcoming barriers, man-made barriers like freeways. Next. That's the one that gets all the accolades when I travel around. Reconfiguration of streets, another key theme. Taking a street that previously may have had an additional lane of traffic and taking out a lane of traffic, putting in bike lanes, key theme. Next. The notion of choice and understanding that bike communities are made up of people who ride every day, who feel comfortable in traffic at speeds, approaching traffic speeds, etc., are also mixed in with other members of the community who are novice, who are elderly, children, etc., and providing that choice. And that choice may mean a configuration like this on the previous Burnside Bridge, although it's been taken out, but it offers a great lesson. The choice, having the ability to make a choice of, do I want to ride in a bike lane next to speeding traffic on a bridge, or do I feel more comfortable being up on a sidewalk? And sort of extruded into the next level, what that also means is providing a facility on an arterial street that maybe has a bike lane, but maybe a block or two away, also providing some sort of bike boulevard connection for people who don't necessarily feel comfortable being on those arterial roads. So choice is acknowledging the diversity of the bike community here, and choice is a big one. Next. Controlling or taming the automobile through design, through traffic calming, is a big one. Creating diverters for cars, but allowing bikes through access is the next one. And then, or another example up on Belmont, putting a couple trees in the middle of the road sometimes is a good way to slow cars down. Next. And then finally, and I haven't really, it's typically part of my presentation, and I was hoping to cut it a little shorter today, but finally having a very active advocacy and activist culture within a city is also a key component to making for a bike-friendly city. A lot of the stuff you've seen in Portland just wouldn't have happened without the BTA, without the Bike Advisory Committee, without some other groups who were advocating for more funds for pedestrian and transit and also bike infrastructure. That is certainly a key component, and I just wanted to finish off with the what I think is just the great promotional poster that the BTA has that sort of shows the sort of spatial dynamics of a city designed for, or streets designed for cars versus those designed for bikes. If you go from the top to bottom, you sort of see the spatial characteristics of a four-lane street full of cars, and if you took those drivers of those cars and sort of put them on bikes, in reality they only fit in a very, very small fraction. I know it's kind of obvious stuff, but to me it's just a great promotional poster I wanted to finish off with to really emphasize the importance of advocacy and bike culture within a city. Thank you. Todd.
Still taking questions?
Yeah, I have 8 minutes.
Well, a question on code and policy. As a transportation planner in Vancouver, you know, we've reached a point where we've striped in all the easy bike lanes, and I think Portland's probably at that point. We have street standards that say that on arterials we have bike lanes for new construction, and in retrofitting, typically we're shunted from doing bike lanes on existing streets because of parking. Yet our standards have typically requirements for bike lanes, but not for parking. Our code does not say parking trumps bike lanes. Typically, you know, our code doesn't. Our code says we should move people and not warehouse cars on our streets. So my question is, does Portland have any code-specific language that would allow bike lanes to trump parking?
I'd like to open it up to some of the PDOT people in the room to help answer that. I don't know. I mean, certainly there have been examples in Portland where parking has been removed. They tend to be in residential areas. Removing parking on a whole side of a street in a commercial retail area is much more difficult politically. But I don't know if the code or policy specifically states a bike lane can trump parking in a residentially zoned area versus commercial. I don't know the answer.
Versus that parking trumps a lane of traffic.
Yeah, I don't have an answer for you. If anyone else could have an answer, possibly that would be great. Here's a PDOT person.
I'll rush in where fools. I think that in my work, it's always better if we're helping the community bring answers to us. And you know, I'm preaching to the choir here. So I don't think that I'm not aware of any sort of hierarchy where one can be taken to court and said this rule supersedes that one, that sort of thing. And I think by the time you've gotten to that point, you may win the battle, but you've lost the war.
I think there are also, and it hasn't been explored too much here, and something to consider in Vancouver and other places. There sometimes are unique design solutions that could help to integrate a bike lane and maintain at least some of the parking by maybe having a sidewalk that has cutouts that do allow like a few spaces here and there. So you're not necessarily removing an entire row of parking, but that does have an impact then on the pedestrian environment because you're taking maybe a 12-foot or a 15-foot sidewalk, and in places you're narrowing it down to maybe 7 feet. just to provide a few spaces to accommodate both the bike and the parked cars, but you also want to maintain a good pedestrian environment too. So there are some unique design solutions occasionally. Yep, Roger.
We did change our policies to expressly give preference for moving vehicles, including bikes, over storing cars on the road when we updated our transportation system plan. And give me a call, send me an email, and I'll show you the language. But it still comes down to individual battles.
So you're saying individual battles, meaning the policy may be there, but politically there's still going to be a fight. Is that what you mean? Okay. Yeah.
So I'm really excited about the remodeling of Morrison Bridge, and up until just a month ago, I used to ride across the Hawthorne twice a day, 5 days a week. I live 5 miles south of here, though, and there's a very apparent geographic boundary that separates the east side from the west side. That there are not actually any good links. Neither the Ross Island Bridge nor the Selwood Bridge provide safe access for bicycles across the river. Do we know of any talk of solutions to that?
Well, one partial solution is if and when light rail is extended to the south, from the Transit Mall to the south, over the river to connect to Milwaukee and possibly Oregon City, that's sort of a further phase, that bridge, which will be somewhere near the Markham Bridge, so somewhere about midpoint between the Hawthorne and close to the Ross Island possibly, will include, that light rail bridge will include a pedestrian bike facility on it. So, and that might be 10 years out. So there's that possibility. There's the long-term possibility that the Selwood Bridge, which isn't going to last forever, at some point that may be reconstructed. And again, that's maybe 10, 15, 20 years out. And that, if that were reconstructed, clearly it would be a little bit wider with sidewalks probably on both sides and bike lanes. So in the next 10 years, I can't guarantee you anything. It is one of the things maybe to hope for in a shorter time frame is because the new spring water extension on the east side of the river, because that provides such a great connection. It's so convenient and completely flat to the Hawthorne Bridge. Maybe the best option to enhance connectivity from neighborhoods like Brooklyn and Selwood is to create a few more places where the neighborhood could connect to the actual esplanade on the river. Right now, you can get on it, in the north end, about near the Ross Island Bridge. You can get on it down near the Selwood Bridge, and in between, there's only really Oaks Bottom Park where you can access that. So that's a potential mitigation in a way to not having a good bridge connection, is at least getting better neighborhood connections to that esplanade, so you could at least have good access to the Hawthorne Bridge. Yeah, question in the back.
Are there design solutions for placing bike lanes next to parking strips so that you don't have the conflict of somebody opening a door into a bike lane? Is there a way to mitigate that?
Well, a lot of it is spatial. If there's space there, certainly the bike lane could be wide enough with some sort of painted buffer adjacent to the parked cars that indicate that cyclists, should be riding at least a few feet away from the edge of a parked car. I know in a lot of the bike lanes in New York City, for instance, the space dedicated to bikes is more like 8 or 9 feet, and the first couple feet next to the parked car is just a sort of a hatch pattern, and then you get the bike lane so that you're away from the car doors opening. So there aren't any examples of that here, though.
But nobody pays attention to those lanes. I mean, cars regularly violate them in New York. So.
Oh, in New York?
Yeah,
well, yeah, it's New York.
I'm thinking more in terms of signage on the street to alert parking facilities that, in fact, they're parking next to a bike lane and therefore they have an extra duty for care.
Mm-hmm. It's certainly a good idea. I can't argue with that. But it hasn't been done. I don't know if that's on anyone's radar screen, unfortunately. A little bit of one of the ironies is I used to live in New York, and I used to ride all the time. And because pretty much all streets within most of the whole city are one way, bike lanes tend to be on the left-hand side. and where bike lanes here and in I think almost all other cities will always tend to be on the right-hand side because you have far more two-way streets, and that's more of a natural place for cyclists to want to be. On one-way streets, when you're on the left-hand side, there's a far lower chance of getting hit by a door simply because you're riding along the passenger side of the vehicle rather than riding right alongside the driver side of the vehicle. So the few places where there are left-hand bike lanes here in Portland kind of brings me back to New York. And feeling much more comfortable riding along the bike lane, having that much more confidence the car door is not going to open. Yeah?
There's another solution. Historically, there used to be requirements that drivers and passengers would have to exit the car through the car to the curbside and not exit into the street. Yet, with the loss of bench seating in cars, that's kind of gone by the wayside.
Historically, meaning what, like early part of the 20th century or 20 years ago?
30 years ago.
Really? When I take one more question, it's 1:30. Yeah.
Do we have any figure on how many people in the city have switched from cars to bikes over the years? I think it's a very important measure to, evaluate the success of all those improvements. To me, improving the conditions for the regular bikers is one thing, but probably more important is to attract more people to switch.
Yeah, that's a great point. Clearly, the system is attracting more cyclists, and one of those graphs showed the number of people using the downtown bridges, which is a pretty good indicator of just general bicycle use throughout the whole city, or at least sort of the inner neighborhoods. Clearly, far more people are using their bikes. I don't know if surveys have been taken that indicate if those are people who are now riding to work, who used to take the bus, or used to walk, or used to drive. But one could assume when you get that many more thousands of people using their bikes, a certain percentage probably used to drive and now are using their bikes. I would think where it's probably having its greatest impact is in inner neighborhoods, people taking short sort of neighborhood type trips when there aren't any facilities within a neighborhood, bike facilities, and you're going to, say, a local neighborhood business where the parking is for free. People who own cars will tend to use their car, knowing they could park for free. But with an integrated bike network, I think you're going to get a lot of people who previously drove to just a local business in their neighborhood or a main street are now riding their bikes. I would think that's where you get the biggest change, those local trips as opposed to commute trips like into downtown. Yeah.
Point, and one of the things I think is important to couple with that idea that we've got this really big trend in growing ridership is the fact that our number of reported accidents and fatalities has remained pretty much so static through that growth period. So we've got a lot more people riding and fewer people per capita significantly getting into crashes and having fatalities. So I think it's a really important part to say when something's going right.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we need to finish. You could ask me a question afterwards, personally, if you'd like. Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.